Here we are again with the second lecture in a series with the title Interpretation, semicolon, and then the topic. Last lecture, the second lecture for week 4 of the course was Interpretation, questions. And there I talked about the importance of asking questions and how everything in history, all historical research begins with questions. Today, the first lecture of week 5, it is interpretations, types of history. Now, I'll be going over briefly different types of history and different subtypes or subdisciplines within those types. And the point here is not for you to necessarily, as such, memorize the slide that's coming up with different types of history and their subdisciplines and things, but rather to start reflecting on history as a discipline and the different component parts thereof. How, let's say, military history is very different from doing economic history, even though they can be very closely related, or doing intellectual history, or religious history, or cultural history, or women's history, in which I didn't put there, but I'll tell you why later. But different types of history help us to answer questions, and it still all begins with the question. And the types of questions we ask go a long way towards determining or forming the type of history that we're doing. So I would like you to listen to this lecture, reflect on it, think about your own approach and what type of history you are doing in terms of analyzing your artifact. You don't have to come up with, I'm doing, history of the Longue Durée, which I'll be getting to later as well, or I'm doing micro history. In some ways, we're all doing micro history, but I'll come back to that as well. But rather just to start reflecting and thinking about your own questioning, your own process, as you are doing your research and working on your project, as you are quote unquote doing history. What type of history are you actually then really doing? You don't have to come up with an answer to that for me. There's no part of the assignments that say, define what type of history you are doing, and then you have to stick to that, and everything else I'll come back to fitting it all together. But just to conceptualize the field of history and the relationship between the various fields of history and our understanding of the past. So we'll be getting to some of those things in more detail as we go along. But to begin, we start back with where we left off in the last lecture, namely with questions and asking questions, because asking questions of sources is where all research begins, implicitly or explicitly. So here we go, second slide, asking questions of sources. It all starts with a question. Now the issue, as I'm sure you're beginning to be aware, because you've all selected your artifact, your source, that's an artifact is a source, you start asking questions about everything from what is this to how did it get here? What made it possible that this thing is here? To how did it work? What was its function? What was its purpose? What was the meaning given to it, as well as the meaning that we can discern in it? Those two-fold circles of meaning, which I'll be getting back to as well, and we'll be talking about as we already have throughout the rest of this course. If we just stop and think about it for a moment, let's pick an artifact. I'll try again to think of something that no one else has picked. Let's say the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. Now, if one of you picked up something like that, it would be having to do it with virtual imagery. I mean, certainly you would be most welcome to go to Washington and actually observe it and measure it and all those types of things. But that certainly would not be required. And so you'd have that disjunction between the digitalized image and the thing itself. I know a number of you are doing digitalized images of things, and that is okay, but you need to be aware of that disjunction, at least theoretically. For the purposes of this project and paper, that's okay, but I still want you to be aware of it. Okay. So we have the Washington Monument. Let's say we don't know anything about it. We pretend we don't. Not that that is a methodological approach. I mean, actually, I had a professor in graduate school. Nice guy, very smart. We didn't get along very well. Not personally fine, but academically, because he always tried to get us, graduate students, to read a source as if we knew nothing else about it. So pretend you're a Martian, we do this. And my point was always, I can't do that. That's impossible. And anyway, here I am asking questions about this source as if we didn't know anything about it. Now, it's not possible, in my view, to actually bracket out everything we know about the Washington Monument, all our previous images, and look at it afresh. But we need to focus on the artifact. And to do that, we have to the extent possible, bracket all our assumptions that we have about this object, whatever it might be. And then we can start asking questions. What is it? And you just simply describe it. That's part of your first assignment, the artifact paper 1, is just describing your artifact with a thick description. And the next lecture after this one is thick interpretation, thick description. So I'll be getting to that. But just to answer the question of what is this, then if we start saying, okay, well, how did it get here? This one object, this one artifact, there are many different approaches to it. There is the physical, technical side. Who built it? How was it possible? When was it built? What material was it made of? And it's like, where did they get the material to build the Washington Monument? Where's the stone from? Where was it quarried? How much did it cost? Who paid for all this? And all of a sudden we start asking questions of economics. Because if we don't, we can't answer the question of how did it get here? What made this object, this artifact, possible that it is here today? And the economic questions are part of that. Because then we have, okay, if it was the government that paid for it, they paid for it with taxes. What was the tax structure at the time? Did people who were being taxed to pay for the Washington Monument know that their taxes were going, at least in part, to the building of the Washington Monument? Or was it a private enterprise? Or was it a combination? Who paid for it? How many people were employed for the construction and erection of the Washington Monument? If we start asking about that aspect of the economic side of things, who actually did the work, then we're getting into issues of labor history. Labor history is part of economic history or is part of social history. But when we say, okay, the Washington Monument, obviously at the time there's a monument, not everybody had a monument made to them. This was for George Washington, who was seen as the founder of our country in so many ways, first president and all those good things. And there's stories and meaning already given to Washington that then there's a desire on the part of some people to erect a monument by which we can memorialize Washington's contribution. That then gets into the issue of culture, of beliefs, of attitudes. And on we go. So we're doing then cultural history. So we can have kind of technological building construction history. We can have then economic history, labor history, cultural history. And we can even then talk about what were the ideas possible for this monument to be constructed and why did they construct it as this obelisk. And there we have things, well, it harkens back to Egyptian models and things. And so we can look at these ideas that went into the form and construction of this thing that allowed it to be built. that allowed it to exist, that'll make possible that it's still there. So we get to analyze the ideas behind the construction of this monument, not only in terms of commemoration and remembrance and the function of public knowledge, but also in terms of the style, how it was all put together, what were the possibilities at the time for making such a monument. They could have just did like with Lincoln, a big statue, blah, 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 blah. Why did they do it in that form? So there are all types of different questions that can be asked of a single artifact. The artifact itself does not determine what the questions are. The artifact asks us questions by its very existence. What is it? Why are you here? Or the artifact would be saying, why am I here? Here I am. Guess why? Or try to figure out why. I have secrets. Can you discover those secrets? Oh, yeah, I'm not going to tell you because I'm just here. So says the artifact. It forces itself on us. Why would someone do something like that? Why would we build a monument to George Washington? We say, well, that's obvious. Well, that's where the assumptions come in. And what we want to do when we start to analyze our artifact is to question those assumptions. Not that they're necessarily wrong at all, but just to put them on a scholarly academic basis so that we pose the question, because maybe they are wrong or only partially right, or only right in terms of the cultural tradition and how it's developed. I mean, that's where stories of mythology comes in. To history, we have with George Washington, the cherry tree story, which supposedly is apocryphal, never happened, but good old honest George said, I cut it down, Father. Okay. Rather than seeing that as an actual event, we have to realize that was a story that was told to make a point. And we have to ask them, why was it told? Who believed it? And why was it believed? What was the context that it was first told and developed? And then on we go to come to a deeper understanding of this story. And is there any relationship between the story and the monument? So there's all these different questions that the artifacts that exist ask us by their very existence. Except they don't ask us. The Washington Monument doesn't really sit and whisper to people who are there to see, why am I here? Can you figure out my secrets? But what I'm meaning is that human beings, going back again, as I said, I think in last lecture or some previous lecture according to Aristotle, by nature want to know. We ask questions. And the question of existence is a major one. Why is something here? Why is it there? Why was it not put somewhere else, or in all these other different aspects? And we have to think about the questions that the artifact itself is asking us implicitly, as well as then saying, okay, then what do we ask about the artifact? If you're here, then we can ask, how did you get here? Why are you here? So, well, wait a minute, you just said those were questions that the artifact is asking us. And yes, indeed, but then what we have to do is kind of listen for those questions that the artifact is asking us, and then put them into our questions that we are then, in return, asking the artifact. And then we have to devise a plan of how are we going to answer those questions. Now, that's what it said here. What is needed to ask and to know to answer a question. We could ask about the economics. We could ask about the technology, the building and construction technology. We could ask about the cultural relevance and significance, both that led to its being made and how it has been, how has it functioned within the cultural setting thereafter up until a different day. We can ask about the ideas. We can ask about were there political debates about whether it should go up or not. We know that there are political debates about monuments today all over the place. What were the politics involved in constructing that monument? And so all these different aspects of it, and the same applies for every artifact we are looking at. Now, we have a question. But to answer that question, we have to ask a lot of other questions. That's when I started saying, in terms of the brainstorming of questions, you first just list anything you can think of, and then you organize them. Also hierarchically, in terms of what are the major questions you want to ask, and then what questions do you need to ask in order to answer that larger question. So let's say, okay, all these possible questions relating to the Washington Monument. Maybe I am interested most of all in the technological side of it, the construction, the actual physical construction of it. So I'm going to have to ask, who built it? And then the question is, how do I go about finding out how to answer that question? Are there other artifacts that signify who might have built it? You say, well, that's a funny way of putting it. Another way of putting it would be simply more, are there records of what company built it? Are there, receipts? Are there descriptions of it? And all those types of things. So we would need to then start asking further questions about trying to get to the answer of a very basic question that is prerequisite to our being able to answer the overall question of what was the technological and constructional factors that went into the construction of the Washington Monument that then would tell us something about the construction industry and the level of technology and understanding at the time. We can't just assume that that is a given and a known. We have to ask questions. Who built it? Who put it all together? Who designed it? And say, okay, design. I'm not going to talk about the intellectual side of things, but I could. In terms of the Egyptian imagery and those aspects, I just want to know who was the draftsperson. Probably could say draftsman in this case, who actually designed it, and who was paying for that, and how does it all fit together. So then I need to say, okay, what material is it made out of? And what do I need to ask in order to find out the answer to that question? What kind of stone? I have no idea. If it's limestone or granite or whatever, I'm just going to say granite because I know that granite is something. I think limestone is far too soft, but I could be completely wrong on that. So this is just a way of flaunting my ignorance of such things. The point is being, okay, let's say it's granite. Where did that granite come from? It's not like the builders who were hired to then design and construct this. Simply said, okay, I'll go down to the local store and get a bunch of granite. Is it concrete? Then we have to pour the concrete. How did we do that? How do we get it up so high? Because if I poured concrete, it's going to we have to build it in a structure. And how did that structure and the scaffolding and all those things get done? And where did those things come from? The materials therefore. Was there one person overseeing the whole project? It was a huge undertaking to build something like that. And so we have then this hierarchy, not in terms of quality, but in terms of procedure, of questioning, that we need to keep asking these questions in order to be able to answer the sub-questions that will enable us to say something about this artifact, to even say something about the past whatsoever. It's terribly complex just for one artifact. So it's questions about questions about questions. And it's okay, this question, here's our big question, but to answer this, we need to know X, Y, and Z. To know X, we have to know A, B, and C. To know Y, we have to know E, F, and G. To know Z, we have to know L, M, and N. And then for those, we have to know it. So all of these different, that's why I say the hierarchy, we could say the pyramid of questions too, if you wanted to put it in those terms, we have to construct our pyramid of questioning, which we start with the top, and then we have to work our way all the way down to the bottom. And as broad as we can make it, we can have a pyramid with a very broad base, very strong base, to support our major question, or we can have it like the Washington Monument, just straight up and down, where it's more narrow. Hopefully, it would not be inverted, because then the answer to our overarching question will be based on very little. Now, once we start asking all these different questions, it's almost impossible not to ask about all sorts of topics and issues. If I want to know about the construction, the technology behind it, I have to ask them about the economics. Where did the material come from? Why did they use that material, not something else? Is it because it was cheaper, or because it was more available, or was it an ideal sense of whatever else? How did they actually put it together? Was this a development? Were new insights needed, new discoveries needed in order to construct this, or was this something that was quote unquote very easy to do at the time? We have to start asking questions about economics, who was actually doing the work, labor, society, all these different types of questions just to answer our overarching question dealing with the construction of the artifact itself. Those different types of questions get to the subdisciplines and the types of history we are pursuing. Still all begins with the question. But I hope you can see by now that just asking a series of questions about your artifact. Try it. Try constructing your pyramid of questions for your artifact. Gets us into all kinds of realms. How do we handle it? Can we? Do we have the competencies, the skills, and the knowledge to deal with all those kinds of issues and questions? And how do we relate all of that to what our primary interest and our major question is? That then we'll get back to that first one. We'll look at then just different types of history. As I said at the beginning, which are to serve to try to stimulate you to reflect on the discipline of history itself and what type of history you are pursuing as you pursue your questions, because it's the question that determines or that forms the type of history that we do. Now, many different types of history, not just one. I have just a listing up here with major general types of history, and then sub-disciplines within them in many ways. Political history, economic history, social history, cultural history, intellectual history, history of ideas, history of understanding, history of thought, history of science, cultural history, high culture, operas, those kinds of things, low or popular culture, low culture, but popular culture, more general, what we do, attitudes and beliefs, everyday lives, social history, class structure, what do people eat, where do they live, how is society functioning, an economic issue, either the macroeconomic issues or microeconomic issues, in terms of focusing on a particular industry. I went to graduate school too. I knew a historian, a very good Renaissance historian, and her focus was on the wool industry and sheep production in 15th century Italy. So she knew a lot about one industry. Did she know about the economics of international trade? Of course she did. But that wasn't what she was actually researching and specializing in. So people specialize in these different subdisciplines within the overarching discipline, as well as I didn't even put up here the chronological periods, because we could say this about all the various chronological periods: antiquity, Middle Ages, Eastern civilization, Western civilization, France, Germany. We have all these different specializations and the different types of history within them. And I could go through each one and explain what I mean by that, but that would then take us far too long. I don't think you really want me to go through and give you definitions and examples of each of these. I would happily do so. But I do want to mention a couple of issues that I previously said I would get back to. One of those is that up here, I did not include, quote unquote, women's history. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. Because for me, you could say because you are a male chauvinist pig and are an old traditional historian and you don't even think about it. That could be, but that's not my conscious reason for not doing it. Once we segregate women out, once we segregate any minority out of economic history, of um, political history, of social history, of cultural history, we are then skewing our understanding because we are focusing on an exception to the quote unquote norm. My point is that women's history is part of all of this. The same thing with, uh, minorities, if we wanted to say, the history of African Americans in the U.S. I don't think we should say simply African American, history. We do. We have departments of African American studies and so things. They're Native American studies, and those are things that are important too, very important too. But in terms of my perspective towards history, that should all be taken into account within these general categories themselves. And if it's not, we're not doing our job. So in some ways, in each of these general areas, we could put women's history and blah, blah, blah. Because why would we say women's history rather than men's history? I mean, if we want to say all this men's history, so I'm going to focus on men and not women, how can we do that? Now, again, I could be getting myself into all kinds of trouble. But all the focus is on minorities, whether it is based on gender, whether it is based on sexuality and preferences, whether it is based on ethnic origins, are all very vital and necessary questions to ask within these broader categories. And I don't have any problem with highlighting those. I'm just talking about the different types of questions. Now, I don't want to sit here and have to defend myself too much, but I hope you can understand what I'm getting at and why I'm not excluding consciously women or LGBTQ people or African Americans or Latino Americans or Asian Americans or Asians or Latinos or Africans as such or any other ethnic group because we can study the history of anything that is human. That's what I'm getting at. Okay. Now, women's history addressed. Then I have up here micro history. You can almost see that. Do I have that? Oh, I have microeconomic history because that's just based on the distinction between macroeconomics and microeconomics. But what do I mean by micro history? Became popular in the 1980s or so, on into the 1990s. And it's focusing on a single individual topic. In some ways, what all of you are doing, what we're doing in this course, is microhistory because the whole project is based on a single artifact. A very good example of microhistory, I think, is a book called 1688. It was actually written by one of my undergraduate professors, John Wills. And what he tried to do is to write a world history of 1688. You can say, well, how's that microhistory? Because he's only focusing on that 1 year. He says, if we just want to look at this 1 year, but do it from a world perspective, what do we come up with? What do we see? Now, there was another book by one of my graduate professors, Don Weinstein, on the history of the duel. And so he's focusing actually on a series of duels in France, or in Italy, in Florence, at a particular time. So it's a very specific focused study, microhistory. So he's not talking about violence, he's not talking about the class structures, but he's using a particular case to open up an understanding of it all. Another great one, Natalie Zeman Davis's Return of Martin Guerre, which actually became a movie. It was a series of inquisitional records in the later 16th century of this French peasant. Fascinating story because it was Martin Guerre was in this French village, and he left on wars. He was gone. He had a wife. I forget if he had kids or not, but definitely had a wife. He was known in the village, and he was kind of a nasty man. Um, Problems there. I mean, he wasn't horrible, but he wasn't necessarily warm and sweet. And so when he went off to join the wars, his wife was not necessarily all that unhappy to see him go. And he was gone for a few years, just disappeared. Of course, this is before the time of Zoom and email and all those things. There was basically no contact. And then all one day, they were almost just ready to move on. His wife was just assuming he had been killed somewhere and was preparing to go on with her life. I think even had a fiance ready to go, if I remember correctly, but maybe not. And this pilgrim comes walking into the village and says, "I'm Martin Guerre." Ooh, he's returned. But all of a sudden, people start saying, "Wait a minute, my gosh, he sure has changed. He's really nice." His wife all of a sudden thinks he's really nice. She didn't have a fiance yet. She was taking him back into her house. Um, and just they started having their relationship flourish. People in the village really liked him. He seemed very affable, and everything seemed to be hunky dory until a couple of years later, another pilgrim came walking in and said, "I'm Martin Guerre." Oops, what do we do now? And it turns out that the first one was an imposter, but that had to be all the way worked out and through. And how do you go about proving it and identifying and all these other aspects? A microhistory that then reflects culture and society as a whole. So it's a very good approach to doing history. Kind of the opposite approach is called the history of la longue durée, which is French because it is kind of the catchphrase of the long duration for what was called the Annales School, N-A-L-E-S, in France. These were social historians in the later 70s and 80s who argued that if we want to understand how history works, we have to do it looking at the long term. We can't just study uh, the French Revolution. We can't just study the Reformation. We can't just study the Civil War. We have to look at the long term structures because underneath all of these waxing and waning of powers and money and wealth and governments, there is an overarching scheme of progression, also very much included with environment. Okay. And it's only when we look at this longue durée we begin to get a sense of what history as such is about. That's why we have up there total history. Theoretically, total history has been equated or associated with, in any case, the annals. Um, but we can also just see it as history as such. In some ways, that book by Jack Wills in 1688 was attempting to do total history, but only of a single year. This annals approach with la longue durée and total history is looking at environmental changes. Just think about how the environment has affected us. And environmental history is a subdiscipline up here. We have Jason Kelly at our department working together with Phil Scarpino, also in our department, is a leading environmental historian in the country. And that's one of the questions they look at is how do human beings affect the environment? How does the environment affect human beings? And what's the history of that? And when we start thinking about it, it does affect us. Why? Um, why do Germans drink beer and Italians drink wine? No, I don't know. It's because, well, climate, what can grow there, the geology of the region and area, all these different things. Why is there, wheat growing in the Midwest and oranges in California and Florida? Well, that determines all kinds of things. Because it is like, the soil, of course, the soil, the weather patterns, of course, the weather patterns. But then that also means the economic basis of those regions are affected by those things. And so we need to look, if we're really going to understand how those I want to talk about microclimates because then we're getting into wine production in Northern California, which I'd much rather talk about. But those geographically particular and distinct areas in terms of their weather patterns, in terms of their geology, what led to that development that made it possible that oranges can grow in California, at least Southern California, Central and Southern California, and in Florida, but not in North Dakota. Why are these weather patterns? How did they develop? Have they always been this way? We talk about the little ice ages. We talk about there used to be, the bridge, so to speak, the ice bridge connecting the Eurasia and Alaska in terms of nomadic peoples and migrating individuals. All these different types of large-scale questions are central for understanding how it is that they've gotten to be the way they are. Now, say, well, total history is simply all the different types of history all put together. That's not quite what we're getting at. A great example of this Annals School, as it's called, is a book on Philip II and Europe in the age of Philip II. I think it's Emmanuel Leroy Lauderdale, but even I get a couple of these figures, French figures, mixed up. No, it's not Lauderdale. It's another one who wrote in the age of Philip II. But it's like a 3-volume work talking about 16th century Spain after the Habsburgs. Charles V becomes king of Spain, and then his son Philip. This is with the Armada and everything else. In the Mediterranean. Oh, it's the Mediterranean in the age of Philip II. That's what it is. Sorry, spacing out here. I still got to think of who wrote that because there's these two great French historians. I can't believe this is sort of my area. I can't believe I can't remember that. Oh well, that shows how memory goes, especially when you're getting old and everything else. But it is an amazing study, and he starts off in the geological development of the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean region, from best we can tell, thousands and thousands of years ago, before he ever gets to, the 16th century and thereafter. And it is a classic study. Does it deliver on what it promises? Is it a total history? Well, it's not in the sense of that there's no other account possible. It gives a perspective that microhistory does not give. But yet microhistory can reveal things that total history, or the history of over the long duration, the long durée, misses out on. There is no such thing as comprehensive history, that we really know exactly what happened in a particular given time, except conditioned by our sources, conditioned by the artifacts that we're actually analyzing and the questions that we are asking. Because everyone, even of the time, have different perspectives. And if we allow what we write to erase the reality of other people, that's a huge problem. If we allow what we write to erase the reality of women, of ethnic minorities, of LGBTQ people, that is erasing them from history. And that's what we've done for so long now when we write history. Why? Because it's been written by privileged white males by and large. And here I am telling you this as well. Our whole concept of Western civilization was developed in this sense. And that is too why I said I didn't include those foci of societies in here as distinct subdisciplines of history, but rather they are part of it all, and they have been erased. Unfortunately, they have been getting a lot more attention by historians, because it would be a very different account from that perspective. It's a very different account of the past and our understanding of it if we tell it from the perspective of a peasant, a male peasant, a female peasant, or a slave, than it is of the quote-unquote winners, the little phrase goes, victors write the history. It's like, yeah, they do, and they have. And that is what we always have to question. So we always have to then deconstruct that narrative in order to give voices to those who did not have voices, to give voices to those who were silenced, muted, and forgotten. Which does not mean we don't need to keep studying the victors. We do, because we won't understand that relationship, so to speak, unless we focus on both, not to the exclusion of one or the other. That's why, again, artifacts are so important. And that's why we've studied these things. Now, moving right along here, for all these different fields, I'll go through this rather briefly. There are, let's say, the ancillary, I can't pronounce it, ancillary fields. And the textbook from reliable sources talks about some of these that you would need to have and to develop to answer some of these questions. Meaning, if you are interested in the economics of the Washington Monument, you better have some understanding of economics. You better have some understanding of statistics and how that all work together. Political science, you should have an understanding if you want to say, I want to look at the political aspects of it. For all these things, social history, sociology, cultural history, cultural studies, intellectual history, philosophy, theology, and science. Some people need statistics. If you're looking at texts, it'd be helpful to have some understanding of literary theory and analysis, as well as philosophy of language and those types of things, of languages, because if you can't read the sources, what are you going to do? Paleography and codicology, that's for anything that is handwritten and is put in a book. How do we understand these things? And all of a sudden, it's like, oh my gosh, no one person can have the skills to understand all of these things. It's very difficult. They don't have the background. How do you deal with that? Well, that limits what you can do. If you can't speak Chinese and can't read Chinese, you can't use Chinese sources or Chinese artifacts. Or if you can only read Cantonese and not some of the other dialects or versions, you're going to be limiting yourself. If you can't read Latin, there's no way you can do medieval or early modern Western Europe. If you can't read French and German, the same thing. And Italian too. I mean, my Italian's not very good, but I can kind of work through some things. But my focus is not Italy. And that is one reason, because of my language skills. It limits what you can look at, the artifacts that you can analyze. If you cannot add two and two, I mean, if math is your weakness, and the only reason I'm saying that is I know a lot of liberal arts students seemingly have problems with math, unfortunately, then you're not going to necessarily be able to do the statistical analysis to answer questions that can only be answered by what's called quantification. It doesn't take a lot of sophistication. We're not talking about necessarily high-level calculus. We're talking simply about some basic math skills, but if you don't have them, you're going to screw it up. We're not going to be able to ask the questions that can only be answered with those skills. If you don't understand something about sociology, it's going to be hard to deal with social structures. If you don't know something about philosophy, it's going to be hard to deal with the intellectual side of things. And if you're doing history of science, most historians of science were first trained as scientists, actually. And so there's that background too. And it's very difficult to get back into that if you are coming to it from a different realm. I'm right now working on some things that are more appropriately into the field of the history of science. And for me, it's a struggle to try to figure it out. Whereas for scientists, even the science that was quote unquote now seen as wrong in the past, but at least they can understand it because they know how things work today. They go back, blah, blah, blah. it becomes very interesting. I can talk about the history of science only in very broad terms, not in specific terms as someone who understands really the actual artifacts themselves, so to speak. So when you are thinking about your object, your artifact, you have to realize what you are limited by. What are the skills needed, the approaches needed, the types of analysis needed, the methods needed to answer the questions that you want to answer, that you are so interested in? And can you answer those questions? Do you have the skills needed to do so? Because if you don't, you're going to blow it. I'm talking about blowing it, not so much in terms of this project at all, but in terms as of a historian. The historian who does not have the skills cannot do the work, period. Or who tries to pretend that he or she has the skills but really doesn't, or simply relies on some other scholars who do have those skills, but then you are limited by what other people have done and said. We all, to an extent, have to do that. In my work, as I just said, history of science, I rely on historians of science. No, I'm not in it. I mean, but for my own work, to the extent that I need it, I rely on historians of science. I can't check their work. I rely sometimes on historians of politics, of philosophy, theology. But that's kind of my area, so I'm kind of in that. So I have to rely on other people, but we have to be aware that we're doing that. And every historian is not writing quote unquote reality, that he or she is writing what they analyze based on the artifacts that they have studied and focused on. So it becomes a very communal endeavor in one sense, because no single individual historian can do his or her work simply by themselves, even if they do all their work by themselves. It is relying on others. But the question is then, how far do we go? Do we rely on what other people have said about the questions that we have asked, so that it's simply all I have to go is find out what someone else has said about this question, and there's the answer. I don't have to worry about it. The answers are known. Or is it to stop to say, wait a minute, maybe they're not. Or maybe I can't find anyone who has actually asked the precise question I've been asking, or have not seen it in the way that I'm seeing it, who maybe in a more general sense have asked some of the, similar questions, but not based on these artifacts. That's why I say that all knowledge and historical research produces new knowledge. All knowledge begins with questions. And if we can't question everything, but we have to know what to question and what we can rely on others for. That's kind of the trick. And the same thing with your project. You are analyzing your artifact. And some of you are chosen artifacts that maybe no one has ever analyzed before. Others of you are looking at artifacts that have been analyzed a lot. How do you make the distinction? What new do you bring to it, if we look at it with fresh eyes, so to speak? And how do we then harmonize the skills, methods, and questions and the types of history? That's the trick. That's what I've been talking about. Now this is the last slide. Because if there is not a harmonization of knowing what skills we need to answer the questions that we have, we can't just simply ignore it. I can't just pretend that the sources that I can't read in different languages, or if there's a manuscript that is written in such a fashion that I can't read it, even though my paleography is pretty decent for late medieval Latin. But some are just horribly difficult to read. I can just choose to ignore it. Completion by deletion. I'm not going to look at that. Then how does that affect my overall analysis and interpretation of the artifacts that I am analyzing and looking at? There could be, issues that for some of you in your artifact that there's been a lot written about it in French or in Spanish or in German. If you don't read those languages, obviously you can't read those things. So what do? Well, you kind of factor those out and say, okay, I'm aware of these different things that are out there, but based on the artifacts that I do have, I can say X, Y, and Z. So that's a whole other issue. That's too is why we're focusing on the artifact itself. Then I have up there the artifact and context, the interpretive circle, which is the problem that we all are in. Because we're asking questions about an artifact, a source. How do we come? How do we answer them? Well, if we rely on what other historians have said, scholars have said, we can do that, but then that's not really getting at it because what every historian has ever written has said is based on simply other artifacts or other sources. So we can't understand our source that we're analyzing without appeal to other sources. But we can't analyze every source because where does it stop? And what is the point of neutrality, so to speak? It's all a matter of interpretation. Every question we ask is predicated on interpretation. And we can never get out of this circular hermeneutic, as I'm calling it, or coming to an understanding that an artifact or text can only be interpreted by other artifacts, even as they interpret that, or the text in the context. The artifact in the context of the text in the context, the artifact in the context. The context is necessary for us to understand and analyze the artifact, but it's only by the artifacts themselves that we have anything to say about the context. So it is a circular problem. It's the interpretive circle, the hermeneutical circle. And the historian enters into that, again, not trying to explain, because once we start saying, I know what this is and I'm going to explain this, the only means we have of doing so is appealing to things that we haven't analyzed. It's a problem. It's a problem that we can't escape. Rather than trying to pretend it's something different, my point is to say, okay, rather than trying to explain it all, we need to enter into that ambiguity and that problem and that paradox to come to an understanding, not to discover truth, but to come to an understanding of how this all came to be and what does it all mean. And our own endeavor of actually doing history affects it as we are doing it. Whoa, that gets back to the philosophical aspect of things. And it's like, yes, it does, because even if we are analyzing the Washington Monument in terms of the technological issues, very concrete, we run up against the issues of, okay, how do I know that? How do I know these are the people that worked on it? Well, I have a document here that says so. Okay, let me critique that document. Maybe someone was forging it. Maybe someone didn't do it completely. So that would affect then our understanding of the whole bit. And so what does that say? So it goes back and forth all over the place to then force us to realize that it is not straightforward, physical causation or an explanation of how A leads to B, that leads to C, that then causes D. It is more problematic than that. It's not a chemical reaction. History is not a chemical reaction that we can look at the agents of change. We talk about the agents of change. It is an ongoing circular process of coming to ever new understandings of the meaning of human endeavor and human existence. Oh, that's grandiose, isn't it? Yes, it is for me. I take history very important or very seriously and see that it incorporates all these things that are there, whether we're aware of them or not, even as we're analyzing a single artifact that seemingly is meaningless. Nothing is meaningless. Whatever artifact you're analyzing, has a story to tell, or it can be used to tell a story that hasn't been told before. That's what you're doing. And you'll begin by describing your artifact. And that will be something I'll be talking about in the next lecture for week 5. In terms of interpretation, thick description, because I don't want simply a name of an artifact or a superficial description. I want a very detailed, thorough description, which all is based on awareness and reflecting on what it is that you are doing and not assuming things you shouldn't assume. But we'll be talking again more about that in the next lecture. Enjoy yourselves. Enjoy your working on your projects and your artifacts. A lot of great ones out there that makes it can be very exciting. And I'll be back for next time. Thank you.